Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a total paradigm shift from our source materials about work, grace, and rest. Specifically, we're going to look at the Sabbath. If you've ever felt totally burnt out by just trying to do too much, well, the writings of Watchman Nee and Witness Lee offer this incredible structural look at how the biblical idea of rest goes from a rigid Old Testament shadow right into a dynamic, living reality in the New Testament. This is literally going to reframe how you view effort and rest forever. Let's get right into it. So let's kick things off by challenging everything you thought you knew with a pretty surprising paradox about creation. Just think back to the very beginning of the biblical narrative. When exactly did God intend for humanity to roll up its sleeves and get to work? I mean, we usually assume the timeline is straightforward, right? You work hard, and then you get to rest. But looking closely at the Genesis account, our sources point out something that is completely backward to our natural logic.
Get this. God worked for 6 days, creating the heavens and the earth, and he created man on that 6th day. And then God rested on the 7th day, which means Adam's very first full day of existence was actually a day of rest. He didn't have to toil or sweat to earn it. He was literally just born right into it. The source material really hammers home this profound principle. We absolutely have to rest before we work. God's work was totally finished, it was completely satisfying, so man's very first experience was just to enjoy the completion of that work.
Section 1. The Old Testament Shadow, Resting in the Done.
Fast forward thousands of years to the Israelites, and the physical Sabbath was instituted as a really strict commandment. But our texts explain that this physical day was basically just a shadow pointing to a much deeper spiritual reality. Here's the absolutely crucial point. Trying to work for God under the law, when you're actually supposed to be resting, is breaking his biggest rule. The Sabbath signifies that man has got to utterly stop his own efforts and accept God's completely finished work. I mean, if you try to work when God has declared a rest, you're essentially rejecting his rest. You're basically saying, hey, what God accomplished, it isn't quite enough. Let me add my own effort to the mix.
And this brilliantly illustrates why breaking the Sabbath was considered such a massive deal in the Old Testament. The sources actually compare breaking the Sabbath to that famous story of Moses striking the rock in the wilderness. Remember, God told Moses to just speak to the rock to get water, because Moses had already struck it once before. The work of striking was already done. By smiting the rock a second time, Moses was overthrowing the accomplished work. He completely ruined the done by trying to inject a do. When we refuse to rest, we're denying God's satisfaction with his own completed work.
Which brings us to Section 2, the New Testament shift, a new creation.
You see, history doesn't just stop in the Old Testament. The sources note that God's revelation is progressive, and the resurrection of Christ, that fundamentally changed the timeline in our entire concept of rest. Notice how the resurrection creates this incredibly clear-cut separation. The 7th day marks the definitive end of the old creation. Work stops. But the first day of the week, the exact day Christ rose from the dead, marks the beginning of a brand new creation. The old creation officially ended and a completely new cycle of life kicked off on day 1.
Section 3. Sunday is not the Sabbath. Busting the myth. Okay, so there's this massive misconception out there that Sunday is just the Christian Sabbath. But the sources argue this is totally unscriptural. A lot of people just assume the Sabbath got moved from Saturday to Sunday, but there's actually a huge dichotomy here. Think about it. The Old Testament Sabbath was all about physical rest and negative commands. It was literally a list of what not to do, with severe punishments if you messed up. The New Testament Lord's Day, though, is entirely different. It's characterized by spiritual pursuit and positive commands. It's not about what we're forbidden to do, it's entirely about the grace of what we actually get to do.
Based on the early church practices outlined in the text, the focus of the Lord's Day is incredibly different. Notice there are 0 negative commandments here, none of that rigid Sabbath flavor. Instead, it's a day of active, joyful spiritual enjoyment. Believers are called to exalt and rejoice, to gather and break bread in remembrance of Christ, and to consecrate themselves. It's a total celebration of resurrection and victory, completely without that heavy burden of the old law.
Moving on to Section 4, Feasts, Years, and Jubilee, Scaling Up Grace.
This is where it gets really amazing. God takes this concept of rest and just dramatically scales it up. The Sabbath wasn't meant to be limited to a single day of the week. It expanded from days into years, showing us the sheer magnitude of his grace. We start with that weekly day of rest, right? Zoom out to a single year, and you've got 7 annual feasts, things like Passover and Pentecost, which were essentially designated seasons of rest and hanging out with God. Zoom out even further, and every 7th year was a Sabbath year, where even the farmland got a full year off. And finally, after 7 cycles of 7 years, we hit the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, the ultimate season of freedom.
The year of Jubilee is literally the ultimate superabundant scaling of God's grace. Hitting at that 50th year, our sources describe it as a Pentecostal year of resurrection. During Jubilee, it was incredible. Anyone who had lost their family land had all their possessions completely returned. Anyone who had sold themselves into slavery was set totally free. The Jubilee points directly to our New Testament reality, where believers who were once slaves to sin are entirely freed and restored to their spiritual inheritance.
Section 5. Working from true rest. Sit before you walk. So to bring this all together practically, we have to look at how this massive theological shift actually changes a believer's daily life, because this isn't just high-level theology. It dictates how you and I operate every single day. Watchman Nee perfectly captures it with this thought. Christianity begins not with a big do, but with a big done. That do versus done motif? It absolutely nails the transition from the burnout of trying to fulfill the law on your own to the deep, true rest of grace. You don't start by trying to achieve. You have to start by resting in what's already been achieved for you.
And that brings us to this beautiful concept of sitting. Before we can ever do anything, we have to first learn the spiritual posture of sitting. Think about when you physically sit in a chair. You relax your muscles, right? You let the chair bear your entire weight. Well, spiritual sitting is the exact same thing. It means resting our entire weight, our heavy load, all our anxieties, and our entire future upon the Lord. It's utterly relying on His finished work and letting Him bear the responsibility. The sources outline this beautifully through the structure of the book of Ephesians, breaking it down into 3 crucial steps: sit, walk, and stand. First, you absolutely must sit and rest in the finished work. Only after you are seated and resting can you successfully walk, which means actually living out your daily life in the world in a way that reflects that grace. And only after sitting and walking can you stand firm against challenges and the enemy. You simply cannot walk the walk or stand your ground until you have first sat down in the reality of God's rest.
Which brings us to the ultimate application of this entire paradigm. Ask yourself, are you still trying to walk before you've learned to sit? It's a really profound challenge based on everything we've explored today. It's time to stop striving in your own exhausting effort. Stop trying to add your do to God's done, and start actually rejoicing in the profound rest of His finished work. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. I really hope this fresh perspective on the Sabbath paradigm completely transforms how you approach your daily life.